All right, hello everyone. Welcome back to Comp 426, Modern Web Programming. This is lecture 14. It's definitely wild that we have had this much snow this semester, so welcome back to another pre-recorded lecture. I think, though, that based on the way that this lecture was set up, I think that it fits this particular format really well, because we will be walking through kind of how our Next.js projects are set up, as well as show some examples. So I think this would be great for you to be able to kind of pause and follow along as we go. And at the end for attendance, you will be kind of submitting the code that you end up writing by the end of the lecture. Okay, so just make sure that you have Visual Studio open and that you have everything set up there. All right, so let's get started here with some announcements first before we jump into the content for today. First off, we have two main announcements. The first one is that AO4 Wordle, this is the assignment we've been working on, is due Wednesday night. So this is still the case. As of now, if anything changes, I'll let you know. But I think that we've had quite a bit of time to work on this, and most people have already started getting it in. So just a reminder that this will be due Wednesday night. And of course, like usual, we have our traditional late policy. Okay. And then another very exciting announcement, A5, which is Pokedex, will open today. And this will be due next Friday on the 28th, I believe is the correct date there, of February. So this will be hopefully a very fun assignment. It is our first assignment in Next.js. It is also a little bit less guided than some of the previous ones, but I think that based on what you'll learn today, as well as all the skills that you have been building up over the last few days and weeks, I think you will be more than ready. And we also, again, because this is due on Friday, we are giving over, I think, 1.5 weeks, so there should be extra time as well to work on it. All right, so that's all I have for announcements. If you have any questions on any of these announcements or on any of the assignments, definitely let me know by the next class. All right. So with the announcements out of the way, we can get started kind of reviewing some of the things that we talked about last time. Right? There's been a lot of different concepts that we have kind of unveiled in a relatively short period of time. So I definitely understand if it feels like it has been a lot, or that the pace has been fast right now. Hopefully, though, as we begin working inside of a Next.js project and some of these things, you'll get to see them actually physically work, it might become a little bit more clear as we go along, right? So first off, on Friday, we introduced this main point here, which is kind of the difference between what we call MPAs, multi-page apps, and SPAs, single-page apps, right? We discussed that with an MPA, right, every time we load a new page on our site, the entire project that's currently running on the client is going to be entirely deleted, right? And we have to re-download a new HTML file and the entire application again from the server every time we navigate to new pages in our site. Right? And we talked about the fact that this presents many drawbacks, the biggest drawback, of course, being user experience. Because our entire application is deleted, and then we have to wait for it to be re-downloaded, the user will see, right, a flash of white on the screen. So that is not very good. We also then, in contrast to MPAs, we talked about SPAs. And the key thing here is that the SPAs, or these single-page applications, add this tool called a router. And this router is really powerful. It helps us modify the default behavior of the browser so that we can essentially simulate page changes, but in reality, we are not making another request, right, to the server. Everything is done on the client side. Right, so whenever we're working with a router, right, if you imagine, and actually I can open up, I believe, a whiteboard here so that we can quickly look at this, right? We have our client right here. We have our client, and usually we have some sort of server. I apologize that these boxes are not very neat here, but on our initial load, right, we will end up loading, we will request some resource, like let's say the home page. The server will respond with the HTML for that page. And so we'll end up with, on our client, HTML. And then, of course, we need to make another request. So after this, we will make a request for, the JavaScript and the CSS and other things. And once we get the JavaScript, so this will resolve in some JavaScript over here, and this JavaScript will begin this React project, right? So we have a React project, and then we also have a router over here. And the key idea is that in our DOM, which we might have kind of drawn right here, right? In our DOM, React is going to update the DOM so that something appears on the page. But then anytime we navigate to a new page, right, the router is going to instruct React to render a new page rather than going to the server to actually grab any HTML, right? So this kind of the idea, and of course this diagram is not very neat, right? But the I guess the animated and very nice diagram is on the previous slideshow. So if you go back to lecture 12 or lecture 13, you'll be able to walk through this and see it in a bit more detail, right? And we also discussed, both on Friday and Monday, kind of the downsides of both, right? So of course, MPAs offer a worse user experience. However, they're very good for, or well, relatively better than SPAs at search engine optimization, right? And in addition, it runs a bit slower. So there's all these different sides, like both pluses and minuses to these approaches. But we discussed that this particular framework, Next.js, has an architecture that helps it to combine the best of both worlds, getting the extremely good user experience. So an extremely good user experience and speed from SPAs, while benefiting from very good SEO and other things from MPAs. And it does so through this amazing system or architecture known as server-side rendering. Well, I guess feature, not really architecture, right? So server-side rendering, and this we introduced last time, but it helps to enable Next projects to essentially have a very good speed while also having very good SEO. We talked about that Next.js is the current #1 React framework. It is a very large project on GitHub, so there are a lot of companies and people using it, and that Next uses React for defining user interfaces. It also uses TypeScript and Tailwind, which is going to help make our developer experience a lot better. Right? So these are all things that we'll actually see. You haven't had a chance to really see a real Next.js project, right? So we're going to have a chance to look at that today, and hopefully it'll make some of these things a little bit more clear. Okay. Now, we also should do just a very quick recap of this terminology that I introduced last lecture, server-side rendering, right? Because we'll be coming back to this idea later in the lecture today, right? So this is, of course, my nicer diagram here now. I have my client over here. I have my dev server over here. We talked about last time the fact that whenever I build my Next.js project, right, so I'm working on it and I have to build it in order for it to be available on a server, whether that be a dev server or whether that be Vercel, right? And this creates this particular folder right here, this .next folder. And the .next folder is not just, right? So this does include our client-side code. So I'll write that here. So this includes our client code, and this would include any, React components. Basically, everything that we write in our app is client code, but it also contains the code to start up a Next server on the back end. And this Next server has a lot of extra functionality, which makes this server-side rendering process work, okay? And so we'll see that here in a minute. And the way that I've done this, both in the previous lectures as well as also, last time and today, I'm showing this process by loading a page on our app so that it makes it easy to kind of tell what is going on, right? So typically, in a normal MPA or a multi-page app or an SPA, a single-page app, if I wanted to, for example, load my home page or load my about page, well, in the past, my server just had either like a index.html or something like that sitting over here on the server. And the difference, though, here is that rather than just returning that HTML directly to the client, right, Next is actually going to try and generate the HTML file on the server first. Right? And this is important because in the old model, with both our React MPA or React SPA, right, however we set it up, our HTML files are empty. Right? They're kind of this empty shell that just contains a div, and then React will render the entire application inside of that div. Right? So by default, if we were to just request index.html and get it back, well, we would have a completely empty page, and the user would not actually see anything until React took over and rendered the page. Right? And so all of that would have happened with a delay on the client side. So here, instead of trying to render my component on the client, well, the server is going to try and render the component first. Right? So this server can run React code. And so if I defined, for example, a app component somewhere in my project, it's going to try and render it into the page right here. And so what ends up happening then is we're going to get an HTML file out that's not just a blank page. Right? So rather than being kind of this blank shell of an HTML file, we're actually going to have an HTML file that looks like what we want our page to look like, right? Based off of the React component that we defined. And so then the server would respond to the client with this HTML. And what ends up happening then is our HTML is going to, because it has all of the content on it, we're immediately going to see something appear on the home page, right? So if my React component had, for example, a p tag here that said home page, well, it's going to show up immediately because it was already rendered, right? We did not need React, which would have been somewhere over here, down here. We would have not needed React to render, right? It's already rendered. So that's kind of the benefit here. And this process where the server over here is actually creating a HTML file, it's actually performing the render rather than a React instance sitting on the client, this is known as server-side rendering. And it is commonly abbreviated to this right here, SSR. Right? So whenever we say SSR, or if you read it somewhere, it is referring to this process of server-side rendering. Okay. And we also talked about last time, I kind of had this open question, and all of you kind of worked on discussing this and determining whether or not, whether or not the page that we actually loaded is interactive or not. And we determined that right now, if we had a button, so let's say on my browser, I had like a alert button that whenever I pressed it would pop up an alert. Well, if I press this button, nothing is going to happen, right? Why is nothing going to happen? Well, we've talked about this in the beginning of the semester. We need JavaScript files here on our client in order for any interactivity to happen on our site, right? We have all these tools. We have all these fancy tools like React and Tailwind and all these things. But in the end of the day, right, our client only cares about HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. Right? The three main types of files that we introduced in the beginning is all the client cares about. And so HTML is used to render the DOM, right? CSS is used to style the DOM and style the components, and then JavaScript is responsible for handling functionality. And so we're missing JavaScript, and so our page, even though it shows up very quickly, it's not interactive. And so the HTML has to fetch the JavaScript in order to make the page interactive. And once it fetches this JavaScript, right, our React app is going to start running here on the client. And now that React is running here on the client, well, React is going to know, because the same component that it rendered over here is now over here, right? We have everything downloaded. So now it knows what functionality this page needs to have. And so what ends up happening is the React will then go into the DOM and will reconcile. Basically what this means is it's going to look at all these DOM elements and figure out which ones need to have some functionality attached to it, and then it's going to go ahead and do so and add functionality, and now our page over here will be interactive. Okay. And this process is known as hydration. So this is a fancy term, and all hydration is taking original, like a static kind of inert version of HTML, and then after the fact going in and adding extra functionality, right? It's a fancy word, but again, you can kind of think of, I think you have used this example in the class, right? Like if you have a if you have a plant and it's kind of dead or dehydrated, right? It doesn't really do much, but then once you water the plant, then it's going to grow and it's going to be all happy and alive, right? And so that's kind of the same idea here. Is once we add our JavaScript, our page becomes alive, it becomes interactive again, but in the beginning, it is blank. Now, this ends up not really having that much of a negative effect on the user experience because this particular reconciliation and hydration process usually happens really, really quickly. And so the user will not have had time to react and actually click fast enough on our site to really, for this to really be an issue. And so that's why this particular trade-off was acceptable. All right. And another key thing to note is that now that we have our next application running on the client side, well, anytime now that we need to change our page, well, the router can just do that. And we can treat now our app like a regular single page application. So any subsequent page load, like for example, if I had a button here that said about and it basically asked me to navigate to the about page, well, when clicking this button is going to tell the router to switch the about page, and React is then going to do that, right? Do I have any arrows on that? No, I don't have any arrows. So I will again show that. So if I had some about button right here, so about, and the user pressed it, this is going to ask the router to change the page. The router is going to tell React to render the about page. And then once it renders the about page, it's going to replace the DOM with the about page version. Right? So everything is now happening. All of my page switches are happening on the client side again. We don't need to go back to the server. And this is, again, beneficial for user experience. So again, the key thing here, because this is a very common misconception, we do not go back to the server to have the server render. The rendering happens over here on the client on any further page load, right? So server-side rendering just happens the first time. And this helps to prevent wastage because, again, we already have our next app running here, so we don't need the server anymore. We can just do it all on the client and remove that extra latency that the internet might cause. So again, the big idea that we have been discussing all along is that with Next.js, you get the benefits of a single page app while still having very good SEO. And you have very good SEO because on your initial page load, your page is already pre-rendered, right? So a lot of the browsers that are used to determine, and the browsers, like the tools that the browsers use to determine whether or not a page should rank well on a search or not, those tools, those crawlers cannot run JavaScript a lot of times. And so if your page is not pre-rendered already, well, the bot is just going to see a blank page. So that's why Next.js with server-side rendering, you have very, very good SEO. Now, the cool thing is that all of this stuff I've been talking about, like routing and this code over here sitting on the server, the cool thing is that Next actually handles all of this for us. So we do not really have to do much setup here. Next will take care of it all. And so as a developer, it makes it really, really nice because you can just write React-based components as your web pages, like as your different pages on your site, and Next will handle the rest. And there's also many, many, many more features that Next.js has in addition to just SSR, but we will kind of keep that out for now because we want to try and, we want to ramp up slowly. And also a lot of those features are specialized and for more seasoned devs working on really large projects that, in our purposes, we don't really need to worry about. All right, so that was a good recap. Now let's actually jump into Next.js and see a real project for ourselves. So I think I have a setup here. I have some installation instructions, but I am actually just going to show these over here in my terminal. So I will go through all the steps that are needed to actually create a new React app. So what I'm going to do is I have a folder called developer, which I'm going to cd into. This is where I would like to store my new project. And so you can navigate to a new directory or parent directory to try and locate a place where you want to save the project. And then what we're going to type in now is going to be mpx. Okay, so this is an X, not an M. So instead of npm, it's mpx. And then create next app. So create next app is kind of the name of the process that I want to run. And then type @latest without any spaces. So this @latest here is referring to the version. So I'm trying to use the create next app tool, which is something that Next.js offers. And this makes it very easy for developing Next.js apps. And if you don't already have this installed, that's okay, because it'll prompt you and say, oh, this is not installed. Would you like to install it first? And then you can do so. Let's see if it tells me that. No, okay, so I already have it installed, but it would say that, oh, you need to install create next app first, should I? And then it'll ask you to type either Y or N, so just type Y. And then we're left with this. So what is your project named? Well, I'm going to go ahead and name this Lecture 14, because I believe that is what we are on, if I remember correctly. And if you press enter, now what's going to happen is Next.js is going to give us all of these different prompts for different settings that we want to use in our next app. Okay, this makes our setup really, really easy, because this one script will take care of a lot of the setup for us. So the first thing, and we can use our arrow keys to go back and forth and select, it says, would you like to use TypeScript? We would, so we'll select the yes. Then it's going to ask about ESLint. We haven't talked about this yet, but you will select yes for this. Would you like to use Tailwind CSS? We will say yes for this. Would you like your code inside of a source directory? We'll say no. And now this is another one, which is very, very important that you select the right thing here, because if you select the wrong item, your app will look very different. Okay, it's asking us, would you like to use App Router? So App Router is a very new kind of version, a new system of Next.js, and it is not necessarily, it is a bit harder to kind of wrap our head around, especially compared to how our current projects work. And frankly, I think that this is something, if you'd like to explore after the fact, after this class, you can. But the Pages router, which is the alternative and what's been around for the longest and what we will be using, that is also, it's very, very stable. There have been thousands of projects deployed right now using the slightly older router, and the developers of Next.js have also come out and said that we are going to support this for a very, very, very long time into the future. So we will select no for now. And then we'll ask us, would you like to use TurboPack for NextDev? You can either select no or yes here. I don't think it really makes a difference. I will just select no. TurboPack is just a kind of experimental tool for trying to make running your Next apps faster, but we don't need that. And then would you like to customize the import alias? We'll say no. And now you can see after that, it's going to set up everything. And notice, we're actually going to also, it will be installing over here. Sorry, I don't want to show that. Trying to get my, let's see. There we go. My drawing is not working. You can also see that it installed it ran npm install. So it ran all of the necessary installations that we needed to do over here with dev dependencies and regular dependencies. So we should be ready to go. Okay. So now we've created this Lecture 14 project. And so I will just cd into it and say Lecture 14. And I will run this command code dot. Now, before I do that, I also want to showcase that you can see that this create next app by default initializes a Git repository for our project. So that's pretty nice. We'll just write here code dot and press enter. And this should open up VS Code for me. I'm going to trust the author. And there are a few other things I'm going to do. First off, I am going to change the color theme here to light so that it picks up a little bit better here on the video. And I'm also going to zoom in quite a bit. Okay, so this we can kind of see our project a little bit better here. All right, so how is this going to work? Well, this is what our project actually looks like. So you can see there are a few things that you might recognize, such as node modules here. You also might recognize this package and package lock.json. You will also maybe recognize these two right here, our Tailwind config and our TypeScript config. And that might be it. After that, we have 3 different folders that are kind of generated by default here. We have a pages folder, which is very important. We have a public folder, and then we have a styles folder. So this styles folder by default can be left empty. You can see it just contains a CSS that sets up Tailwind for us, so we don't need to touch this. Our public folder just contains a bunch of icons that are used in the site, so we can ignore this one also. But pages is the most useful thing. So you can see here we have this API folder, we have app.tsx, document.tsx, and index.tsx. So I would, if you're working on this, go ahead and right-click on this API folder and delete it right now. We're not going to be worrying about setting up APIs in our projects right now, so you can delete that. That way it's a bit cleaner and easier to see. All right. Now what I want to do is I want to open up this index.html, and you'll see that there is some extra stuff here which looks a little bit strange, but ultimately down here, this should look familiar. This is a React component. So you can see here it says export default function home, and then we have all of this JSX, which should make something appear on our screen. Now to actually run our project, we can go to the terminal, which is right here, and we can run the same command that we did before, which is npm run dev. And running npm run dev, you'll see that a few things happened. The first thing is that over here in our sidebar, we have a new .next folder. And this is really cool because this .next folder is the exact .next folder that would go on the server if you were to deploy. Okay, so I think somebody had asked on the Monday lecture kind of how the next build actually works and how the JavaScript ends up looking like. Is it kind of compressed? Is it in a different format? And you can actually see here that if I go into this server folder, you can begin to see that we have a bit of, we have all these different JavaScript files that our build generates. We also have static, and under, I believe, development, you can see here we have this build development and SSG manifest. So again, all of this stuff is going to be very hard to read, and you don't actually need to ever go in here at all, right? This is purely the build output. It's like trying to compile a Java program and reading, right, the .class file. We don't really need to look at this, but that is what it's there for. And now you'll also notice over here that in our list, we have, in our terminal here, we have this right here that says Next.js, and we have a local, and then we have this network right over here, right? So this local URL, you'll see it says localhost 3000. This is the URL that our project is now running on. So it's running on a dev server, just like how it did in our Vite project. So if you hold down, I believe it is command click to actually open this URL, and you'll see that it opens up my next project. So this is the home page. It says Next.js, get started by editing pages.tsx, save and see your changes instantly. Right, so now if I go back to, and I listen to what it says, so I have this pages index.tsx, and let's just say I delete everything in here, and I make a very, very simple component, because that should make, there's a lot of stuff on there. Let's just say hello world. Well, I can write export default function home, and I actually have, looks like Copilot is auto-completing it for me, so I have return div hello world. And if I switch back to my browser, you will now see that it says hello world, right? I can also add, for example, a class name, and I can start writing Tailwind styles in here, such as text to Excel, text, I saw a nice color. Maybe I can choose one like this lime green and font bold. And if I save and go back, you will see that now my text has been, updated on my screen, right? So this is a React component, but you'll notice that as I'm changing this React component, the page that actually appears on my site has changed. So let's learn a little bit now about how we can kind of have and set up all these different pages on our site, and how it works in relation to this pages directory. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow, which is somewhere here. Okay, so what we're using, and you saw this or you kind of heard me allude to this when we turned off that app router setting, is using something called the pages router. And a very key thing to note, and you'll be seeing this for the remainder of the semester as well, is that Next.js uses file-based routing. And also, sorry, let me try and reset this here. Okay, there we go. So Next.js uses file-based routing. What does this mean? So it means that how Next is going to assign URLs to components is going to be based off of how they're positioned in the actual file structure of our project. And so all React components that are placed within this special pages directory in our project are considered pages. And when I say pages, pages are going to be standalone pages on our app, right? So this is like a web page. So for example, in the examples that I have shown, we have like /home maybe, /about. These are separate pages on our site, and so whenever we put a React component in a new file in the pages directory, it's going to create a page on our site. And so in order to be assigned a route, a component must be put in this directory. What I mean by assigned a route is, well, I can have I can have many components. However, only some components are considered to be a page, right? So for example, in my Wordle game, I had, I believe, something like, and let me see, I can open up my whiteboard. I believe I had something like the app component, which is my, which kind of contained my entire homepage. And then I had in here, I know the Wordle, like, I'll call this Wordle grid because I don't remember the exact name of it, but I had something like Wordle grid. And then inside of Wordle grid, I had like a Wordle grid row. And then inside of this, we had a bunch of Wordle tiles, right? And so you can see that we can have many components in our page, many components like in our website, but only one of them ends up actually referencing a full page on the site. Right, like the actual game. So when I load up the game, right, I have my entire page, which has the Wordle grid, which has all the rows, and then it has all of the tiles. The entire page is defined by this app, by this particular app component, right? So this up here, this would be considered a page. Whoops. All right, there we go. This is considered a page. And the rest of these are just considered just regular old components. And we only want to be able to navigate between pages, right? So for example, if I went to localhost 3000 and I loaded the home page, I'd want this route to point to this particular component. However, I wouldn't want, for example, some URL like localhost 3000 / let's just say row. This should not be going to this row component, right? Because this row component is not supposed to be a page on my site. It's just supposed to be a regular old component for composition purposes. And so that's kind of the differentiator here between pages and components. All right, so this is an example that I have right here in terms of an actual structure, and let's discuss how this works. So as we mentioned before in this particular slide, is that any component that is placed within the pages directory is going to be considered a page. And so if we have a .tsx file inside of my pages folder, which is right here, so everything inside of this folder is going to be considered a page, right? And so index.tsx, whenever we write index, well, just like when we had index.html, that is referring to the home page. Right? So index.tsx is going to refer to the home page of my overall project. It's like in my pages, it's at the furthest, I know it's kind of hard to see, but this is the furthest left indented. So it's directly under this pages folder, index.tsx. That means that this particular page, so the component that is located on this page, is going to run, or it's going to load at this route, right? And that's kind of what we see over here. This component that I had, this component is inside of a index.tsx file, which is inside of my pages directory. So when I load my home page, it's going to run this particular component. Now, if you were to have, for whatever reason, multiple components in your file, like let's say I had something like this, and by the way, this is bad practice, so you shouldn't do this, but if you have like export function title, and I said return, and let's say I return this h1 up here, and then I put title down here, right? Like let's say that I did something like this. The component in my file that has this default keyword attached to it, this particular component is going to be the one ultimately attached to the route. Okay, so if I had like multiple components in my page, the one that says default on it is going to end up being assigned to that URL. All right, so let me undo this. And why I say bad practice here is because if we wanted to have like standalone components like this, we shouldn't put them in this pages file at all. Even though we have default here, which would allow us to differentiate, we probably shouldn't. And so the best practice here would actually be creating a new folder at the top level. So all the way out here, new folder called components. And you can see components is a folder at the same level as pages. And we can create a new file called title.tsx, move this in here. So I take this, I move it here, I add well, I guess, yeah, I'll add default here. And now from up here, I can simply import the title from my components folder. And this will work. So if I run this, and every time I refresh, it should automatically update my page. And so you can see that it is showing the correct component. And just to prove it, if I went here and changed my color to blue, you will see that it is now blue. Okay. So if you're ever trying to figure out like, okay, I want to have like all these custom components, where do I put them? And they're not pages, well, then you can put them inside of a components folder up here. Okay. All right. So that's our home page. However, we can also define pages using either full file names or through folders. And so for example, if I wanted to have my web page URL /example, well, I can create an example folder. And then the index that is right over here, sorry, my pen keeps turning off and turning back on. So hopefully, okay, now it's showing up. I will ignore this toolbar for now. Index.tsx inside of this folder is going to be the homepage for this subroute. So if I have pages and then I add the example folder, well, I'm going to add to my route example. And then when I have index.tsx, I add a slash. So now my example page is going to be defined in example index.tsx. Now, I want to be very clear that it would have been totally acceptable to also have a file down here that was example.tsx, and this would have the same effect, where on my page, my two routes on my page would be my home page, and it would be /example. Okay. But the reason why I have a folder here is if I want to have multiple pages that might be attached to this subroute. For example, if I wanted example and I wanted something like example foo, right? Or if I wanted example foo bar, right? Or some crazy URL, well, in this case, I have multiple different cases that I have to handle, right? I have to handle the case where it's at the end here. I have to handle a case where I have another page here, and then I have to keep going. So that's why having a folder is really nice, because we can handle, for example, the home page here, and then I could have like another folder in here that was like foo, and then have another file in here that's maybe like bar.tsx, right? And so again, how my my components are laid out within this pages directory directly affects how it renders and how the URLs are kind of attached to my different pages. Now there's another really cool feature here which is called dynamic routes. And if we supply our file name to be brackets and then we put some text in here, like let's say slug or maybe ID or name or something like that, well, what Next will do is then on any route that's, for example, ./example -foo, right? Or /example /bar, right? Or /example let's go with one of my TAs, I guess, like David, right? Then this bracket here is kind of like a catch-all. So anything where I have I'm in my example folder, so anything that comes after it will all be caught by this particular file name, and the text that's actually here, like foo, bar, and David, will be saved to a variable called slug inside of my component. So I can have one TSX file that essentially defines the UI for potentially multiple different pages. And this is really, really useful, right? So I want you to think about an example with recipes, right? Like let's say I have 100 or so recipes in my site, like maybe I'm New York Times cooking, right? That's the site that I'm working on. And maybe I can have nytcooking.com or whatever it is. And then maybe I have like /recipes. And then maybe I have / and then something. Like let's say I write here, I'll do another one of my TA, like Audrey's favorite cookies, right? Cookies or something like that. Or maybe I have recipes. That's like Ajay's tiramisu. I don't know. Right? These are multiple different recipes. I could have hundreds, I could have thousands, right? Or even tens of thousands of recipes. And I wouldn't want to have like a custom kind of component for every single one, right? I might want to instead just kind of have a template. So I have one single page that should, represent a recipe, and then I can supply maybe the ID of the recipe and load some data after the fact, right? So maybe I have one single recipe component, and then when I load my recipe component, I go to some server and search for the recipe here, and then I return it back and I work with it, right? And so everything that comes after this, so this kind of suffix of like Audrey's favorite cookies and Ajay's tiramisu, this would be saved inside of this whatever parameter I put right here. So in my let's say I was making my pages router structure for my New York Times site, I might have a pages folder, and then I might have here index.html, sorry, not .html, .tsx, which is like my home page. But then maybe here I would have recipes. So recipes. And then in here I would have maybe like recipe ID.tsx. And I can define kind of a shell, a component for my recipe. And then depending on the recipe that's selected, it's going to load different data in here, right? So that's really, really cool. And we're going to see an example of this. And then I also maybe have here, I could under recipes also have index.tsx. And maybe this is like a catalog of all the recipes, right? So it's kind of like the recipes homepage, and we have like maybe a list of all the recipes. And so ultimately, this would be assigned the route of just /, right? This would be assigned the route of recipes because it's within the recipes folder. And then this right over here would be assigned anything that's like recipes and then / anything that is like a single recipe ID, right? So that's kind of the structure for how dynamics routes work. And I'll show you how this works in a minute because it's really, really cool. Okay, or we'll see a real example of it. And so again, here I have a note, like many URLs can match this. So for example, if I had example matcha, that would load this component. Example boba, that would load this component. And then we can utilize this text here, matcha and boba, within our component. So let's see an example. So I can go back to my code over here, and let's say that I try and replicate this recipes example. So under my pages directory, I will make a new folder for recipes, and in here I will make a new index.tsx. I will write a function, so like export default function. Maybe I'll just call this like recipes home. I will maybe return a we'll just have a div, and then maybe just a paragraph that says recipe list, and then maybe I'll have maybe eventually I'll have some sort of list here where I have I don't know, I'll write here Audrey's favorite cookies. I don't know what they are. If I will see if I can find this information out later, but let's say that I want to have a list of recipes and this is a recipe page. Well, what I can do is I can go in here and create a new file called, well, let's just say slug. Slug is kind of a funny word, but it's often used for like these type of like textual IDs is often referred to as slug. So we use slug here. And what I can do is I can write export default function recipe page, and then return a div, and then this is like a recipe, right? But the thing is that I can have multiple different recipes, so I want to make sure that I am loading my recipe kind of based off of the ID that I pass in here, or the slug. Well, I can do that by first connecting to my router. So there is a very nice API called useRouter. It is a hook that Next.js gives us, and this allows us to tap into the router and kind of its different features. And it only takes one line to do so. So I can write like const router equals useRouter, like that. And if it shows, we might have to import it from next/router. And so now we have useRouter, and I can, let's just say on my screen here, I say recipe slug, and how we actually access this from this right here, I will have to type in router, which accesses my router, and then query, and then dot slug. So what goes after this dot query is going to be the thing that is inside of the brackets. I'm going to show you what I mean. So I'm going to save my code. I'm going to go over to the browser, and let's say that I navigate to recipes first. If I go to recipes, you'll see that it's going to render this particular index.tsx. It's going to have recipe list, and then it's going to have Audrey's favorite cookies. Well, let's go to, let's say, Audrey's favorite cookies. And if I press enter, notice that the slug that I passed in right here is now rendered on my page here, recipe slug Audrey's favorite cookies. If I change this to Ajay's, for example, tiramisu, well, it updated to Ajay's tiramisu, right? So this is really, really cool because it means that I could, for example, have a bunch of slugs, and then using some fetch call in this file, I can go and request some data for a recipe, and then maybe it will just show up, and I now have a recipe on my page. So this is really, really cool. And I want to prove to you that if I rename this to, for example, ID, I can change this to .id, and it will work. Right? So you have to keep in mind that whatever goes after query, in this case I call it slug, is going to be the same thing that should be within the brackets. Whoa, sorry, I messed that name up right over there. Now, there's two other files here that you've probably noticed, which is _app.tsx and _document.tsx. And real quick, I want to show that. So basically what this is, well, the app.tsx is actually a special component that is used to render every other page. You can kind of think of this like a pass-through. It's like every single component in like index.tsx, if I'm like loading the home page or if I'm loading the example page, it's going to be rendered through this. So you can kind of think app.tsx is like this wrapper around all of my content. And this is really nice because, for example, if I wanted to have like a toolbar, at the top of my site, that no matter what page I'm on, that toolbar still shows up, I can put that in app.tsx. So you can see app.tsx, this here is this generic component. So any component that I load on my site is going to be referenced by this. So I could put this in here. So I have this. Let's say that I make this a div. I put my component in here, and then let's just say that I were to put like P, this is a nav bar or something, right? If I go back to my site, you will see this is a nav bar, will be on my recipe Ajay's tiramisu page. It will be on my regular recipe list page, and it will be on my home page. So that's a pretty cool way of kind of persisting things like a nav bar. And then I will also, let's go back to this. I want to show one other thing, which is that I want to kind of emphasize this, is that whenever we want to navigate to a new URL, so let's say I have this Audrey's favorite cookies, I want to navigate whenever I click on this to the page, we do not want to use an A tag, right? So typically we would use a/href and then maybe recipes, Audrey's favorite cookies, right? I think did I have two quotes here? No. Okay, my quotes are good. If I click on this, it does work in this case, except we actually made a full request to the server. And I don't know if you can see this, but my page kind of very briefly, right, flashes to white. This is actually because it's trying to make a request like a multi-page app and reload my entire page. If we want to use the router instead, we need to use the router's specific link. So you can see here, if I use the link element imported from next link, and I change this here to link, and I save, and I go back, notice how now there is no, and I arrow back, see there's no flash, because I'm not making any network request. It is just working all on the client side. So this is kind of how I would recommend actually using and navigating between pages, using the actual link element. That way you are taking full advantage of the single page app features. All right, so I am very sorry. I know that I'm going over a little bit because I have a timer running next to me to make sure that I'm, to kind of keep track of where I am. But there is one last thing which is really important, and I want to show this. I want to show this real quick. So the last piece of information, and this will be useful for the assignment, is about fetching data, right? So typically, we fetch data by making a network request from the client to some server somewhere, right? So how this works is I have my normal client, and for example, Wordle, right? When I loaded my Wordle page, I wanted to go to that URL that was like, a04-wordle-api.vercel.app/API/random word or something like that, right? That made a request to that website. So I made some network request to the A04 Wordle, right? Wordle API website, and it gave me some response back, like so. And then after that, my page loaded. And it's not like it loaded. What I meant is that it loaded in the Word so that I could actually play my game, right? But while we wait for this response, our site might be in what we call like a loading state, right? Like we might have a spinner animation saying that we're waiting for some data to load, right? Like for example, my recipe, if I was trying to access Audrey's favorite cookies and it's on some server somewhere, it has to go and find that information. So maybe while I navigated to the page and it's loading the data, I have like a spinner, right, that's saying loading, or like, something like loading ... right? That's because I'm waiting for this process to happen. Now, usually we make a network request from the client to a server, and of course, this can take time. And I think I have a very similar thought process here about baking recipes for some reason, right? So you can see here, imagine I'm trying to load baking recipes. Do I need to load more data past that initial recipe, right? So think about it. If I'm going to a recipe for Audrey's favorite cookies, well, on that page, am I going to ever need to load any more data, right? Like it would be nice if I could just load the data with the rest of my HTML so that I don't have to worry about anything. Right? I don't have to worry about a loading screen. There's not all this like loading and waiting and all of that. And in addition, think about SEO. Think about SEO and kind of the way that we're currently working with this. If we're trying to load our, let's say, Audrey's favorite recipe on my page, and I load it in a search engine crawler, well, even though I have SSR and it's giving me some HTML, well, without the recipe data, I can't actually display a recipe on my page, right? I'm again going to have either a blank screen or the bot is going to look at something that looks like this, where it's like, sorry, this is very bad, but it's like loading, right? This is what the browser is going to see, or this is what the crawler is going to see. And remember that crawlers can't run JavaScript. So that network request that you made going to the server for that recipe in order to load it back and to make this page appear, well, that's not going to run on the search engine because the search engine cannot use JavaScript. So already, notice how we kind of, we're back at the same problem that we had before, which is that for search engine optimization, because we're making this network request on the client side, well, it requires JavaScript. And if a crawler can't run that JavaScript, then we're never going to get that. We're never going to get Audrey's favorite recipe. And the search engine is never going to know about Audrey's favorite cookie recipe, right? So that's a problem. So again, JavaScript never runs, so this data is never fetched. And so what did we do last time to kind of solve this SEO problem? Well, we solved it using SSR, right? The process that the server is going to generate my HTML, right? It generates this HTML by rendering our React component. So what if instead of just trying to render the HTML for the page, what if we also just load our data here? Because if I'm trying to load Audrey's favorite recipe, I ultimately want the recipe, right, to be returned. And it's going to, right, I need the recipe for my HTML to properly render anyway. So why don't I just load it here? And so instead, the server itself, instead of the client, the server can request the data, bring that recipe down, and then generate an HTML with the recipe already in there, right? That is another very, very useful feature of Next, is that we can do what we call the server-side requests. We can request data down over here when we are rendering our page. So during this render process, we can load some data. And once that data is finished loading is when we actually render our page and then give it back to the user. And so this is really cool. So how this works is we need to fetch the data on the server, and then this is going to be used as input into our component so that we can access it so that it can render and we can access the data. And so by doing this, we don't need to make a network request on the client side, right? So before, again, just for the diagramming sake here, if I had the, and I'll try and make this, actually, look at that. I have a nice square this time. All right. So if I have like my Next server here and I have my data server here, so this is my, whoops. Let me undo that and change to this. Okay. So let's say I have my data server, which is storing my recipes. So my recipes are in here. And then I have down here my Next deployment. So this is like my actual Next project where I have the like .next folder and I have some Next, right? This is the Next server code. And then over here is my client, right? Before, what would have to happen is this. I would have to request the recipe page. Next would render it to be an HTML, which would not include a recipe in it, right? Because we don't have the recipe data. This would just kind of look like an empty page again. We would get this back. And so now we have the HTML here, and maybe we have a title that just says like recipe, but we have no other data. And then we would, after that, have to make a request to the data recipes, the data recipes server, get the recipe back from the server, and then display it to our user, right? So this is kind of the user here. the recipe does not appear until after step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4 happens, right? So it takes all of this just to to make a recipe appear on our page. And so the thought process is, well, instead of kind of doing it this way, we can instead just, when we request the recipe page, the server can get the data and get the recipe. So this now, it has the recipe and it can now generate an HTML that will have, right, the cookie recipe on it. So that when I render it, my user will see, right, Audrey's favorite cookies or something, right, whatever recipe. So this kind of seems a bit complicated. How does it work? Well, Next.js makes this super easy, right? So kind of how I've been talking and some of this stuff, it sounds a lot harder. Like it sounds a lot worse than it is, but it's actually not that bad. So let's see this in action. So let's say I go back over here and I am going to, because I don't really have a recipe API on me, unfortunately, I have to kind of change my example. I'm going to do the example of trying to load a random word, right, from my Wordle API. So for example, I'm going to go, let's say I go here to, actually, let me change that. I'm going to do the verify, so like to verify if a word is valid or not. So I'm going to create a new folder that's like word, and I'm going to now create a new file that is word.tsx. And so this word should be my input. So if I had like export default function, word page, and I can return, and you'll notice here it says word detail, and then let's just say, is word valid? Right, so maybe this is checking is this word that I have loaded in. And remember, because I'm using router, I need to include this use router hook so that I can access the router for Next.js. I can say router.query.word. This will then automatically fill in with the word that I put in here. And now in here, it needs to either be true or false, right? But in order to display this, we need to make a network request. And remember that we did this using useEffect. So maybe I could have something like const is valid, set is valid, right, equals use state from React. And let's just say that this is null to begin with. And also, it's very nice. We can set our types for our use state in here. So I can say that I'm expecting a Boolean or I'm expecting nothing, right? So this is kind of my data type for my use state. I lost my annotation again. There we go, right? And so I want to use effect that runs at the beginning of my whenever my page loads. So remember, we do that by having a empty list as our dependency. Whoops. Right. There we go. Empty list in our dependency. And now we need to load some data. So I can say like fetch. And I believe it was. And I hope that this works first try. There might be a setting that I have to change, which we won't worry about. But I think it's HTTPS. It was AO4 Wordle API, I believe, .vercel.app/verify word, and then the word that we actually want, which we have from this string right here, router.query.word. And so we fetch this, and then after we fetch it, we will end up with some JSON, and we can then set the value of is valid based off of what we have, and I can pass this in over here. So another thing that we actually need to do here is we need to add API in here in order to make this work. And then also another thing I realized I had to cut off, and I'm back here because I think this is slightly more complicated than I thought. This is actually, it's a long story short, this also needs to be in the in this dependency array because we're technically working with a hook here. This is a bit beyond your concern. You will not have to do this. So this is just here. And then also I should write in here like, because this can be null. So if you notice here, there's a chance that this is undefined. We also need to unwrap this. So if, router.query.word. So if it exists, then we do this. Okay, and now we should get something appearing on the screen. So let me do that. And if I refresh here, you will see now it says that hello is true, right? So there's a lot of extra setup here, right? We had to load our page, which was empty relatively, and then we had a use effect, which then fetched the data, and then after fetching the data, we updated the state, and then we printed it out, right? Very, very complicated. It would be nice if we could just preload this on the server rather than having to load it here on the client, and that prevents us having to do all of this stuff, right? It prevents us from having this null version of isValid, where we have to deal with whether it's null or not, where we have to like unwrap this query word and use this strange event handler. It would be very nice if we could just do it on the server and have it pre-render. Well, we can do that by using Next.js's getServerSideProps function. And so getServerSideProps is something that is kind of built into Next.js. And so by adding a getServerSideProps function below the component in one of these files, Next.js recognizes it and makes it work. Okay, so let me show you how this works. We would type in export, and we would type in, and we can actually see it's beginning to autocomplete this. We want to type in async because this is technically going to be an async function. We don't have to worry about the asynchrony, Next.js does. We run function, or we write function, and then get server side props. And this will take in a context as a parameter. This is again built in, this is by Next.js. And the specific type, since we're working in TypeScript, is get server side props context. Okay, so if you want to add a type annotation, you can, and this should be imported from Next. Okay. And so now what does this function do? Well, you can actually see that over here, it's kind of giving me this autocomplete this autocomplete here, which is to, well, we end up returning an object that includes this props array or this props object. And in fact, this props object is going to be used as the input property for my function, right? So this is really, really nice. Right, so this right here, this is what happens. This runs on the server. So runs on the server. And this is going to return, right? This returns some props. So this is step 1. And then step 2 is when on the server I'm trying, so when the server tries to render this component, these props will be passed in to the component. Okay, very, very cool. Now, I need to also fix some of this autocomplete because this is not entirely correct, but what I would end up having here is I need to access the router from here. And actually, it's very easy to do this in the getServerSideProps function. So instead of using the useRouter hook, we end up actually just typing in, I believe it is context, and then .query, and then .word, right? So this makes it really easy. So instead of using router.query.word, which we had above, right here, we would use context.query.word. And this, let's just say that this is what I am trying to pass in, right, to my fetch. So what I would do here is, because this is an async function, I can use await. So I can say like const result equals, and then run this fetch right over here. And I can await it. So I will wait for the result to come before I try and return this and then render my page. So down here, this would be context.query.word. And so what's going to happen is my result is going to be the JSON object that is returned from my API. And the specific type is going, so the type of this return is going to look something like, I think valid is correct. So it's like valid and then Boolean. So what I can do is under props, I can say is valid and assign it to result.valid, just like that, right? And this is very cool because then up here in my props, watch this. All I have to write is valid, And I think it might ask me for a type. Yes, it's going to ask me for a type, so I can provide a type annotation here. So type props equals is valid Boolean. I'm trying to use this type alias so it's easier to read. So like the type here that I am importing into my component is going to be a Boolean. Okay, and so now I don't need the router, I don't need the state, and I don't even need the effect. Right? All I have to do now is write, is my word valid? Well, I can give a response. Is valid. If it is, we'll say yes. If it's not, we'll say no. Just like that. And the cool thing is I can add on to this. So instead, if I wanted to return the word I used as well, I can say word and use this context.query.word and pass that along in the props. And so then all I have to do is just add word to my props as input and write word string is valid Boolean. And so now I can just write is word valid, yes or no. And now when I go back, you can see it tells me when I refresh, is hello valid? Yes. If I change this to React, is React valid? Yes. If I change it to something random, it would tell me, is it valid? No. Right? Isn't that really, really cool? So we eliminated all of that use effect and all of that state management and everything simply by using this getServerSideProps. We fetch the data on the server. The result of our fetch is then used. The result of this is used directly as the property for our component, and we can trust that Next.js is going to handle this, and the ultimate result that we give to our user is going to be HTML with our data here. And this is, again, really, really cool because if I had like a recipe and I was loading, right, Ajay's favorite recipes, I could have just this export default function getServerSideProps, which takes in context. Sorry, this has to be async, not default. So export async function getServerSideProps, getServerSideProps context. I could do something like const slug equals context.query.slug. And then I could do like fetch recipe and then return props recipe and then my recipe right here, right? So I can fetch this recipe and then pass it in. And then in my recipe page, I can bring in recipe as a prop and then use it directly in my HTML. And that's really nice now because since this is happening on the server, the fully rendered HTML with this prop included will be given to the client. And so now, by using this setup, rather than just fetching manually using useEffect, I have very good search engine optimization for all of my individual recipes. All right, everyone. I, again, am very sorry. I know this went a little bit over the traditional 50 minutes, but I really wanted to make sure that I provide enough examples. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be recording a second video that is optional. And in this video, I'm actually going to kind of extend on that one Tailwind example we had where we were trying to recreate the Excel homepage. And I'm going to show you all of this stuff, Next.js, using getServerSideProps, and using also useQuery. useQuery we haven't talked about in class, but I put it in the reading or in the assignment write-up for you to look at. I'm going to use all of that to recreate the organizations page on the CSXL site. Okay, so I think that this will be really helpful. Of course, the site that I'm talking about is if you go to csxl.unc.edu/organizations, it is this one. So it is the one where you can see all the organizations, and then you can click on organizations to get some details. Okay, we're going to recreate this in Next.js using all the things that I have shown you. And it's optional because the code will be posted. I don't really want, I don't want it to be, very, I don't want this to be too long where you have to watch all these videos. But I think that if you were having a bit of trouble following this, or you're still a little bit confused and want to see an example, I think that'll really, really help. All right, everyone. So I don't want to hold you much longer. Feel free to submit any code that you wrote. It doesn't have to be fully complete. During this lecture, when testing stuff out to Gradescope. This will, of course, be open all the way until Friday so that you have ample amount of time to do it. I hope that you have a restful and enjoyable kind of time off due to the snow. And I'll see you all, well, either back on Friday or maybe on Monday, depending on how things go. All right, take care. See you then.